I'm very pleased to welcome Cullen Murphy to Politics and Prose. Murphy is the editor-at-large of Vanity Fair and the former managing editor of The Atlantic. His previous books include Rubbish, Just Curious, The Word According to Eve, Are We Rome, and God's Jury. In his newest book, Cartoon County, Murphy writes about the enclave of Connecticut cartoonists and illustrators, often from a personal point of view. Murphy's father, John Cullen Murphy, was a member of this community as he drew the popular comic strips Prince Valiant and Big Ben Bolt. Eventually, father and son collaborated on Prince Valiant, a collaboration that lasted 25 years. Murphy reflects on his relationship with his father as well as on why these men were drawn to Connecticut, a question I ask my parents every single day, as well as how World War II affected the cartoonists and their art. Mark Bowden, author of Black Hawk Down, writes, "What a find this book is for anyone who grew up, like me, devouring the funnies, cartoons, and comic books. Where did all these delightful things come from?" Colin Murphy, son of a renowned cartoonist, has sketched and inked the backstory of this unique literary and artistic subculture, and wrapped into it a colorful, loving memoir of his parents and their very large family. Now please join me in welcoming Cullen Murphy.
Thank you very much, Katie, and great to see you all this evening. I've got some aids here, and so from time to time I'm going to, why don't we start with that one. From time to time I'll put one of these up, and you'll soon know why. So first of all, in a nutshell, what this book is about. It's about my father, and it's about the group of people who were his friends, all of whom were cartoonists, and all of whom lived basically in the same part of the world in Fairfield County, Connecticut. This is the world of my childhood, the childhood of my brothers and sisters, and it was kind of an odd world, as you can imagine. There were about 100 of these people, cartoonists, who socialized with one another, lived close to one another, and really formed a very close-knit world. Now, that is my father. 1942. He is fresh out of the Art Students League in New York, and he is 23 years old. And every time I look at that portrait, I think that doesn't look like the portrait a 23-year-old would do of himself. It is so confident. You can feel his youth bursting out. There's a war coming, and for him that's good news because it means he gets out of New Rochelle. And he's just starting out on his career as an illustrator and not yet a cartoonist, but he's pretty darn good. And every time I look at that picture, I think, gosh, I wish I knew that man. Because, of course, I didn't. This was painted 10 years before I was born. The person I knew was this guy. And I'm not kidding. So my father did 2 comic strips in the course of his lifetime. One of them was called Big Ben Bolt, and the other one was called Prince Valiant. This was from 1950 up until 2004. And to do these strips, bear in mind that in the course of his career, he probably drew the human figure 200,000 times. And it was a big help to have something to work with. So he would pose for Polaroid pictures of himself. I have thousands of these pictures. They start around 1950, they end around 2004. When they begin, he looks like the guy in the army self-portrait. When they end, he looks like Don Quixote. In the middle, he looks a lot like that. And sometimes he's wearing a wig that is not his hair. He wished it was his hair, but it's not. But he's doing all kinds of things. He's shooting arrows. He's sitting on a sawhorse, pretending to fall off a horse. He's on his back, having been, lanced through with a broomstick that's pretending to be a spear. It's an astonishing collection of photographs. I can't imagine that there's anyone actually in the world, there's not a president, a head of state, a movie star, who has been the subject of as much kind of loving attention to himself as my father is. I've often thought that just putting these together as a book would be fun in its own right. My boyhood job, until blessedly I was able to get out of the house and go to college, was to take these pictures. And in afternoons I would get home from school and go out to the studio, which was a magical place. And after the pleasantries, what's happened with the baseball game, what movie are you watching on TV, there would always be pictures to take, things like this. And from time to time, you'd be taking a picture, he'd be looking like that, and the electrician would come in with the bill. And for us, this was normal. For the electrician, not so much. Now, so the question, why Fairfield County? Why Connecticut? Why were 100 or 120 cartoonists and illustrators all living in one place? Because there were tons of them. Back in the mid-1960s, two of those cartoonists, one of them being Mort Walker, who did Beetle Bailey, and the other being Jerry Dumas, who did Sam and Silo and Sam's strip, decided that they were going to do this, which was make a map of Fairfield County as if seen from the air, and just write in the names of all the cartoonists that they knew. But of course, they ran out of room. There's only about 40 cartoonist names there, and there's so many others that they could have put. But it was an indication of just of how in their consciousness it was that the center of gravity of the making of comic strips, and to some extent even comic books and also illustration, had moved out of New York City and into Fairfield County. I'm not going to name all the strips that were done in Fairfield County, but I'll just give you a quick range, because almost all of the ones that you've heard of were done in this vicinity. Popeye, Joe Palooka, On Stage, Little Orphan Annie, Blondie, The Heart of Juliet Jones, Superman, Henry, Snuffy Smith, Rip Kirby, Beetle Bailey, Hi and Lois, Hagar the Horrible, Prince Valiant, and on it goes. Ernie Bushmiller, who did Nancy, lived in the area. Very interesting man who designed if I have this right, designed a machine for picking citrus fruit for some reason. A lot of cartoonists had an odd side to them, if you don't think the original side was the odd side. And Bushmiller was someone who, you may know that the comic strip Nancy, which is very stripped down and elemental, and it's not hard. And it's so simple that people think there must be all kinds of hidden meanings to it. The Bushmiller himself, when he was giving advice about drawing comic strips, would always say, "Dumb it down," which of course is a challenge to academe, which wants to redouble its efforts to find further meaning. And there was one about 10 or 15 years ago, a writer created something called the Ernie Bushmiller Samuel Beckett letters. And, true, Groucho Marx and T.S. Eliot actually did have a correspondence. So it's not totally implausible, but these were completely made up, and of course have entered the mainstream as something that we now take seriously. Some of the cartoonists whom I write about who were very close to my father were people who were very well known to my brothers and sisters and I, and I'd like to talk about a few of those people. One is Mort Walker, who did, he's still alive, he's 94, Beetle Bailey and created Hi and Lois. His children are still involved in both of those strips. And in some ways, he was a bit of an exception to the run-of-the-mill cartoonist. The run-of-the-mill cartoonist was a person who was probably a bit of a slob, could be mistaken for, a car salesman or village idiot or anything in between, had no business sense, depended on a spouse to pretty much run the show, and was gregarious, usually pretty funny. Mort had some of those qualities, but he was a great businessman. And so alone, virtually, of the comic strip artists, he had an operation that really hummed along. He would have monthly meetings. I mean, people became cartoonists so as not to have monthly meetings. But he would have monthly meetings. He would have 5 or 6 people who were, on his wavelength in terms of humor, come to his studio. They'd each bring 40 gags. They would rate them. It was, it was kind of like agribusiness, the way he ran the comic strips. And very successfully. These were people who all had terrific senses of humor. And if you ever met Mort, though, you would think that he was, perhaps a pharmacist. And but he turned into a very, very wealthy pharmacist. He did something that I'll show you later, which was, it's an example of how people who did comic strips can invent their own reality and then have it become real. I mean, isn't this a neat trick? Isn't this something we'd all like to be able to do? He invented names for the things that happen in comic strips, like when you see drops of sweat coming off somebody's head, indicating hard labor. Do those things have a name? No, they don't have a name. Well, Mort wanted to invent one, and he invented the name Fludes. What about that wavy line that comes off a hot pie? We need a name for that. Wafterons. So he did a whole book of these things. And now if you start Googling those words, you'll see that they've taken on a life of their own, in the culture, as if, oh yeah, those are flutes. It's a technical term. Dick Brown worked with Mort for many years. First as the artist for Hi and Lois, and then he created Hagar the Horrible very successfully. And now Dick was a real slob, and much beloved of children. Anyone with a kind of ursine, unkempt look, the way he had haircut 9 months ago, scraggly beard. Anyone with a look like that is almost automatically beloved of children. He would keep food in his pockets, telling kids, you never know when, poverty may be just around the corner. And he was something of a philosopher, extremely well read, though he had never been to college. During the war, a lot of these people had been in the war. They knew he could draw, so they put him to work making maps. Whoever thought of that? You remember the writer Heywood Broun? People used to say that he looked like an unmade bed, and Jerry Dumas, I remember, used to say of Dick Brown that he looked like an unmade Heywood Broun. Stan Drake was a very different sort of cartoonist. You can divide the group into 2 types, essentially. One is the Bigfoot comic strip artists who do the funny strips, and then the other type, and it's kind of shrinking, has been for decades, are the adventure strips, the realistic strips, things like Rip Kirby or Prince Valiant, my dad's, or The Heart of Juliet Jones, which Stan Drake did. The Heart of Juliet Jones was just a luscious strip. He had learned to draw by copying publicity photos of Hollywood actors and actresses. So everybody looked great in his strip. And he was a very kind man who, when my father came down with pneumonia in the 1960s, this was a time when they still had things called oxygen tents, which no one No one under the age of about 60 remembers. My father was in the hospital with an oxygen tent, and Stan Drake came, and he did all the strips for my father while he was sick. He was an early adopter. Comic strip artists mostly just use pen and pencil and paper and ink. Stan was always the first person to try out something new. He'd find, an electric racer, for one, which the other cartoonists thought this is just heresy, using an, Albrecht Dürer didn't use an electric racer. But then its utility became rather plain. The Xerox machines, being able to take photographs of something like a Manhattan skyline, put it on a Xerox machine in high contrast, cut it out and put it down on paper with an instant background shot. It was always Stan who was thinking of this kind of thing. Wonderful, wonderful guy who carried a tragedy with him all his life, which was there was a great cartoonist named Alex Raymond who did Flash Gordon and Rip Kirby, Secret Agent X9, which was written by Dashiell Hammett, and Alex Raymond was a car buff, and Stan had gotten a Corvette. This is 1956, and Alex Raymond wanted to drive it, and they went driving in the back roads, I think, of Wilton. It was a rainy day, over a rise. Alex Raymond lost control of the car and was killed. And I remember hearing that story from Stan many times about what happened that rainy afternoon when, it was, in the world of comic strips, it was like, the day the music died, the day that Alex Raymond was tragically killed. And finally, there's Chuck Saxon. Charles Saxon, you may know, he was not a comic strip artist, but he was a New Yorker cartoonist, one of the best. Over the course of his lifetime, he did something like 85 covers and 800 cartoons for the New Yorker. You know his work, even if you don't associate his name with the actual work. It's always, the most affluent part of suburbia, people wearing pastel jackets and pants, self-satisfied, a little smug, usually holding a Manhattan or an old-fashioned, and saying things like, honesty is one of the better policies, or, and he had been a bomber during World War II, as so many of these people, as I've noted, were in the war, and started working for the New Yorker relatively early, and became one of, it's hard to think of an association closer than the one between Chuck Saxon and the New Yorker in terms of defining a comic sensibility. Unlike a number of New Yorker cartoonists, he wrote all of his own gags, and his last words I always think of as being a New Yorker gag, just waiting for a Charles Saxon cartoon to be written about, to be drawn around it. It was, he had a heart attack at his home, and so falls to the floor, knocks over some furniture. EMTs are called. His wife is there. The technicians are taking him out the door on a stretcher. He can barely breathe. He turns to his wife and he says, "Honey, I guess I better die. I just broke our best lamp." That takes presence of mind, to get your last words right. Let me turn now back to my father. So, where did he come from? And how did he get into this world? So that's a Saturday Evening Post cover, as I think you can see, and it was drawn by painted by Norman Rockwell, and the model is my father. Now, my father, before Rockwell moved to first Arlington, Vermont, and then Stockbridge, he lived in New Rochelle, New York. And New Rochelle at that time in the 1920s and 30s was kind of like what Greenwich, Stamford, Wilton, Westport would become. It was the hot place to live, and a lot of illustrators had moved out there. J.C. Leyendecker was another. Fontaine Fox, who did Tilly the Toiler. My father lived 2 doors down the street from Norman Rockwell. And one day, Rockwell saw my father playing baseball. As you can see, he had a shock of red hair, and he looked like what we now think of as, a Norman Rockwell type, and asked his mother, would it be okay if young Jack modeled for him, which he did. But in the process, he also learned an awful lot about drawing and painting. And I have a sketch that Rockwell did, in fact, when he gave my father an assignment, which was, my dad would go over there, Rockwell would, help him out a little bit. Then he would say, just probably to get rid of him, here's a book of Hemingway short stories. Why don't you do some oil paintings based on these short stories? And my father, he was 14, he's 15 in that picture, would go home and he'd read the Hemingway stories dutifully and then come back with his work, and Rockwell would critique it. And I have a sketch that Rockwell did for my father, and it's the sketch that says, "No, do it this way," and then the painting that goes with it. It's a wonderful, 1-2 punch. And the association with Rockwell was important for my father for a number of reasons, but one of them was Rockwell arranged for him to get a scholarship to the Art Students League in New York City. The Art Students League still is one of the extraordinary loci of classical training for artists. All kinds of people have been through the Art Students League, including people that you wouldn't think of. Comic strip cartoonists, for instance, I gave you a list of strips a few moments ago. Probably half of those artists had been to the Art Students League. Mark Rothko went to the Art Students League. Didn't use the training very much, but he went to the Art Students League. And so did my father. And it was a form of training that, if you'd gone back to an atelier in the 1850s or 1750s, it would have been very much the same as what you were getting in New York in the 1930s. Live models sitting in the middle of the room, people with their drawing pads arranged all around. And my father was such a pack rat. We have hundreds of these life drawing sketches from the Art Students League. And then came the war, and I wrote a piece about my father and the war for American Heritage magazine about 20 years ago, because the war in some ways was the most formative experience of his life, probably personally until he had 8 kids, and that was supplanted pretty quickly, but definitely in terms of himself as an artist. He began to explore many different forms. That portrait, that self-portrait that I showed you at the very beginning is an example. That was probably the finest piece of painting work that he had done up to that point in his 23 years. But in the Pacific, he was on General MacArthur's staff, and he was used as an artist by the general staff to basically curry favor with other people. We're having trouble with Admiral so-and-so, could you do his portrait? And he explored not only portraiture, but landscape, watercolor and oils, cartoons, using pen and ink with watercolor washes. And the work that has survived really shows him just going in every conceivable direction and expanding his horizons, the way he thought about his work, the way he thought about subject matter, and I think kind of realizing that he could do anything, which is, in fact, what he did throughout his life. Although he eventually got into comic strips, he really did everything. And after the war, as the newspaper business began to, surge back into sentience and vitality, something one wishes we would see now, comic strips began coming back on stream. Newspapers got fatter, pages got bigger, and new strips were called into existence. My father took one of those over, called Big Ben Bolt, written by the brother of Al Capp, who did Lil Abner. It's a pretty closed system here, and then after doing that for 20 years, took over Prince Valiant. Let me turn to a Prince Valiant page. I just want to remind myself of how large that is. So that's almost the scale on which my father worked. Slightly smaller, but basically, if you take a broadsheet newspaper page from around 1950, which was not too much smaller than that, that's the size in which the Sunday comics appeared. It's these days you open a newspaper on a Sunday, and it's just hard to imagine the prominence that the Sunday comics had 50 years ago. Just to take one syndicate, the distribution arm of the business, King Features would put out 16 pages like this every Sunday. It was about 65 or 70 square feet of comics, with maybe 50 different features, in those 16 pages. They were so important to the newspaper business that on Sundays, the news was wrapped inside the comics. You didn't have Dewey defeats Truman wrapped around the comics. It was the other way around. And the mass influence of cartoonists and the kind of presence that they had in the culture is one of the things that I was trying to recapture in this book, because it's largely unknown to younger people now. When my father took over Prince Valiant, there was a lag of about 7 or 8 years before Hal Foster, who had created the strip, decided he wanted to give up the writing too. And I began submitting ideas to the strip, for the strip to him, and then eventually tried to do it his way, which is breaking the dialogue down into parts, giving my father descriptions of what to write. And I remember sending him my first attempt at that, and then having dinner with him, anxiously wondering, what does he think of this? I've been successful so far just giving him plots, but now going the extra mile and doing what he did, it was an important step, and it was an unsuccessful one. The first time I tried it, he took me to dinner, and of course I can't eat. I'm just waiting for him to deliver the verdict. And he said, finally at dessert, he brought up the subject, and I said, "Well, what did you think?" And he said, "No good." And there were no curlicues or kind of Baroque pattings on the head. It was just no good. And but then he stopped and he explained why it was no good. He said, text and pictures, it's a very natural way for people to perceive things. It's been going on for centuries, but it's actually very hard to put it together in a way that people perceive it the way you want them to. You can't just caption the picture with words. What's the point of that? You're slowing down the pace. Pictures have to do one thing, text has to do another thing. You're kind of leapfrogging with meaning and pace and action as you go from panel to panel. That's what you have to do. And then he said, and also bear in mind that white space between the panels. You think nothing is happening there. Wrong. In that space between the panel, 90% of the action of the strip is happening in there because the reader is making the inference. You've set them up. They go to the next panel and they intuit, oh, I see, in that white space, the following things must have happened without even thinking about it. All right, so the trick is, how do you make the reader do that? And then, of course, this is a wonderful lecture. And that question, how do you make the reader do that, is the difficult one. But he stayed with me, and I eventually figured out how to do it. And as Katie mentioned, I worked with my father for 25 years on the strip, and it was a wonderful thing to be able to carry on the relationship in that manner. So before turning to your questions, I wanted to put one more thing up, and that's a page from Mort Walker's collection of terminology for comic strips, and I'll just leave it up. You can take a look. It's called the Encyclopedia of Comicana. But one reason I like this so much is because of what I alluded to earlier. Just the capacity of cartoonists to create a reality and then, live in it, help it along to acquire a certain reality. And that was one of the things that came across, I think, to all of us kids in my family as a lesson of this world, which was, here you have 100, 120 people, many of them misfits by ordinary standards, who somehow at an early enough age had the idea that they would be able to make a living by drawing stuff on paper and making jokes or telling some kind of adventure story. And they never gave up that dream. They actually did it. They did it in different ways. They cobbled it together. Maybe they had to draw a program for the Mets or the Yankees to make a little extra money, or do some portraits on the side or whatever. But they found a way to create lives on their own terms, more or less doing what it was that they had set out to do when they were 12 or 13. And that's a wonderful example, particularly in a part of the world, Fairfield County, Connecticut, and perhaps Chevy Chase, where a lot of kids feel they're on a track that they're not always encouraged to deviate from. But I know in our family, that was not the case. The message was always, figure out what drives you, and then figure out a way to get there. We're not going to stand in your way. Look at your father. And that's a pretty wonderful message. It's certainly not one that any cartoonist was intending to convey, but it's one that they did. To close, I'd like to read just one very short passage. It's about Dick Brown, and it kind of captures an elegiac tone that was in my mind as I was writing this book. I showed you a map, the map of Fairfield County from the air a few minutes ago with all those names. And a couple of decades ago, Jerry Dumas, who had helped create that map, found the original of it and was looking at it and realized how many of the people reflected there had passed away. He began putting a red line through all of those names and then stopped. This was not doing anyone any good. And But it was around that time that I went out to see Dick Brown and his wife, Joan. And I had a conversation with Dick. So we were having lunch at his house in Wilton. His wife, Joan, was with us, and the television was on in the background. Joan, by then, was suffering from emphysema, and she moved about the house on a motorized scooter, hooked up to a tank of oxygen. For some reason, Dick wanted to change the channel, but every time he used the remote, wielding it clumsily with his arthritic arm, he also caused the seat on the scooter to rise. When Joan used her controls to fix the seat, the channel would change. For several minutes, the two of them engaged in electronic warfare. When the fun was over, Dick came back to what we had been talking about. He was under no illusions. He said, "I feel right now the way I used to feel as a kid when the movie was over. The credits would start to roll, the lights would start to come up, and I would walk slowly backwards up the slanting aisle, watching the screen, just trying to make it last as long as I could." Thank you very much. And I'd certainly be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for your very personal glimpse inside the life of this community, and especially your connection to it. You really brought it alive with the drawing, so thank you for that. So what is the future of comics with the disruption of newspapers? Will they survive somehow in another format?
Yes, they will indeed, and it's a subject that I've thought about quite a bit. The newspaper industry has been shrinking for decades. Comic strips have been taking up less space. For a while, it was a deliberate strategy to just downsize the comics and gain some economies on the margins. And of course, that's just a rearguard action. That's not going to do anything fundamental. I remember Mort Walker at one point was so distressed at how small the strips were getting that he once sent in a Beetle Bailey in which all the characters were pre-shrunk, and as if, take that, newspapers, and they didn't care. And readership, newspaper readership has been declining, including of Sunday newspapers, by a few million every few years. So I don't think comic strips as we knew them are going to come back in the form in which we knew them. But a few moments ago, I was talking about this combination of text and pictures being something that human beings are comfortable with. Nobody needs instruction on how, I've got these pages here with pictures on it and text. I mean, I don't know what to do. Nobody has that reaction. Everybody gets it. Children's books are like that. It's a very, I'm sure there's science behind it, but it's a very powerful combination. So that form is never going to disappear. And I don't know where they are, but there must be a couple of aisles here of graphic novels. And that is what the future is. And I think it's going to be a very bright future. I'm sure, actually, if you project 100 years from now and you ask people in the business, so what's happening now? And they'll say, oh, that's probably, that was the third golden age. And I don't see how that will not be the case. And there's one element to graphic novels that just pushes their creativity further than any cartoonist ever could in the newspapers. When you have 150 million people reading comic strips, the pressures exerted by the newspaper or the syndicates in terms of keeping the material at a certain level, not saying certain things, don't go there, are immense. When you have all of these graphic novels which are finding niches, profitably so, the freedom that the artist and writer has is enormous. So you're free. You just have much more capacity to do things that cartoonists in the past never could have done. Yes.
Again, thank you. I second all the comments in the previous question about what you were able to do here in capturing the community. And my question will be about the New Yorker that you referred to once at least. But before I get to that, I can't resist mentioning an anecdote that represents my own very small personal contact with the community that you're talking about. It's sort of a tenuous one, but sometime back in the 1990s, I was looking for a vacation place to take my family, and we had 2 little boys, and they wanted to fish, and there was a place listed in some list in Arlington, Vermont. It said Artist Studio, and it was kind of the least price option that we had, and so I called back then. You called on the phone to make arrangements, and I said, by the way, who's the artist? And they said, well, it's Norman Rockwell. Mm-hmm. And I said, Norman Rockwell? Yeah. And so I didn't want to spoil this deal, so I didn't ask too many questions about it. But anyway, we went up there, and sure enough, it was his Arlington studio that had been sort of barely converted into a place for people to stay. And still around were all these props that he had used. He had used this large studio as a place to stage his photography, and his system was very much like the one that you mentioned with the Polaroid camera, starting with costumed people. And anyway, so
and there's some pictures of that in here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of the studio?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Really? Okay. Well,
not of Rockwell,
okay.
But well, there is a picture of him posing a girl
people.
for a particular picture.
Yeah. Well, it was a huge success, the whole vacation. So we went back the next year. Price had gone up somewhat. And, anyway, but the question, the New Yorker, you mentioned one New Yorker artist and sort of alluded to others that were part of the Fairfield community. I've always been a big fan of New Yorker cartoons. Were New Yorker cartoonist artists kind of as well represented in the Fairfield thing as the strip cartoonists that I recognize also from the 50s and 60s? Kind of a very different kind of cartoon, a different audience and so forth.
Yeah, there were.
So is there anything about Fairfield that made it better or worse for New Yorker cartoonists compared to other cartoonists?
Well, a lot of the New Yorker's audience was in Fairfield County, and who, of course, wanted the sensibility of Manhattan.
Right.
And so, just thinking in terms of proportions, of all New Yorker cartoonists, more of them lived in New York City than in Fairfield County. Right. Whereas of comic strip, you had a preponderance in Fairfield County, but you had a lot of them in Fairfield, New Yorker cartoonists in Fairfield County. Whitney Darrow was there, for instance, and James Stevenson was there, and I saw James Stevenson shortly before he died, which was about a year ago, and we were just sitting down talking about this and that, and one of the things I wanted to ask him about was, how do you get your ideas? And this is the question that people hate, and so it's important to ask. And Stevenson was well known inside the business. Like Charles Saxon, he was someone who always did his own gags, came up with them. Unlike Saxon, he also came up with gags for lots of other people. And he told me, he said when he was joined the New Yorker, because he had this gift, the editor at the time, I think it was Jim Garrity, said to him, "You must never tell anyone what you do." And because there were people like Peter Arno and Charles Adams who were using the work of Jim Stevenson. But Stevenson was explaining when he got into a bind how he would just try to get his mind going, and he would make two parallel lists of nouns, like church, car, bicycle, and another list. Almost didn't matter what they were, and then he would just draw lines between them to free associate, two disparate nouns to see if something happened.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it must have. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Over here.
You
mentioned that when Rockwell drew your dad, it was pretty much a career, life-changing thing for your dad. I'm thinking your dad had a lot of subject models right in the same house. Did you end up in a number of strips? Did the rest of the family?
Yes, and just to be clear, it wasn't being the model that was life-changing. It was the experience of working with Rockwell and training with him that was life-changing. But yes, I did spend some time as a model. Here's me, right there. I remember a deeply embarrassing. I mean, we hated being models. There are pictures in here of my brothers and sisters, being dragooned into the studio to pose. But I remember once when I was probably 6, where it was a Big Ben Bolt series, and I don't remember the plot, but it was something along the lines of a little kid from India has been orphaned, and Big Ben Bolt, this prize fighter, has to bring him up for a period of weeks, and they needed a kid to play this Indian kid, and I was the 6 or 7-year-old at the time. So this entailed just wearing some shorts, nothing else, and then one of the diapers that were never far from visibility. These were cloth diapers, remember, back in the 50s, wrapped around my head like a turban. So a Fairfield County vision of what an Indian orphan looked like. Welcome to my childhood, which was wonderful. Yes.
Thank you again. It's wonderful to see as more material on the whole Fairfield area. In reference to that, I was interested in, were you at all involved with Mort and the creating of the museum that was up there? And then a second question is, or observation, it would be fascinating to see a whole book of the posed pictures, and then maybe if one could find easily the pieces that they're the pose for.
Right.
That would be fun.
Those words you used, if one could find easily. This is one of those projects that I think of as
A fan would be grateful to do it.
I know. No, there'd be many people would be grateful that when it was done. The question is who would do it. The matching of these things. The Iranians who went back and pieced together all the shredded documents from the embassy. It's a job for them. But on your first question about the museum was Mort Walker's dream, and it started around 1980, and he had built a great collection of original comic art, and 10,000 pieces or something like that, and so he willed the museum into existence. Now, over time, it could not sustain itself, and so in the end, what happened was that all of the material that he gathered was given to Ohio State University, and it's at the Billy Ireland collection, where there are now something like 2 or 3 million pieces of comic art. It's a fabulous repository, and the people at Billy Ireland were extremely helpful to me as I was putting this book together. So it's all been saved, and there are a few other places that save it as well. So it's finally in good hands. A far cry from the, say, mid-1950s when Mort Walker discovered original Crazy Cats being used to plug a leak in the ceiling at King Features. So.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of this history. I didn't know much about this world at all. I guess I'm wondering what you think writers or people who are just working with text can learn from comics and the way they go about just creating them. We were talking a little bit earlier about sort of using the sort of space in between the boxes, I guess, and sort of, yeah, I just wonder what writers can learn from comics.
I think the short answer is simply economy, knowing how to do something quickly and with few words. And, I'm not sure it needs to be a full-time active training, but to have some experience in which you look at elements like pictures and text and just ask yourself, how quickly can I get my point across? If you make it your cognitive task to shrink that until it's happening as rapidly as possible with full comprehension, that's an interesting exercise to do, and tough.
Thank you.
Yes.
My quick question is about reprints. Do you know if Fantagraphics is going to carry the Prince Valiant reprints into your father and your era, and also if Big Ben Bolt will have more collections than the single one? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Fantagraphics, if you don't know it, is a superb publishing house. I don't know how they do what they do. And the Prince Valiant edition that they've just, have you seen that? $180 or whatever, is magnificent. And whether they will just keep pushing forward and getting them all into print, I don't know. But that is the general. If you just look at the, just to use a highfalutin term, the forces of history, it is to get all of this material between hardcovers, and you see it happening with many, many different strips. So I don't know how long it will take, but I'm sure it will. Yes.
Prince Valiant never ran as a daily, and its colors were uniquely suited for the Sunday paper. And in between weekends, I always enjoyed reading some of the creations of the Arthurian legends in hardback with artists like N.C. Wyeth. Any relationship between your dad and Hal Foster and Wyeth, or other people like him?
Well, certainly between my dad and Hal Foster, they were very close. Right. And both of them, both Hal and my dad, looked to that classic kind of illustrator that N.C. Wyeth represented, J.C. Leyendecker, Howard Pyle, even Arthur Rackham. These were the people who, in their pantheon, were the great illustrators, and they would like to have seen themselves as in that same tradition. So your weekday reading was of a piece with their perceptions of what they themselves were doing. Good work. Thank you very much. Thank you.